There is a quiet lie that almost everyone believes. It sounds soft. It sounds comforting. It sounds like healing. Love yourself. You've heard it 1,000 times in video captions, in quotes layered over sunsets and slow music. And yet, despite how often it's repeated, something feels off. Because if you were truly practicing self-love the way it's being sold to you, your life wouldn't feel this confusing. You wouldn't feel stuck between wanting more and settling for less. You wouldn't feel exhausted trying to be enough for everyone else. You wouldn't feel this constant internal tension, like part of you wants to grow and another part just wants to escape. So let's be honest for a moment. What if the version of self-love you've been taught is incomplete? What if it's not just ineffective, but actually holding you back? Because real self-love is not what most people think it is. And once you see it clearly, you won't be able to go back to the old definition. The problem, modern self-love has been reduced to comfort, to ease, to softness, to avoiding anything that feels difficult. It tells you, rest when you feel tired, walk away when things get hard, protect your peace at all costs, do what feels good. And on the surface, none of this sounds wrong, but here's where it becomes dangerous, because it quietly trains you to confuse comfort with care, and those two are not the same thing. Comfort is immediate, care is intentional. Comfort says, this is hard, let me escape. Care says, this is hard, but I will stay and grow. Comfort avoids pain. Care understands that some pain is necessary. And if you build your entire identity around avoiding discomfort, you don't become someone who loves themselves. You become someone who cannot handle life. Look around. People are more self-aware than ever before, yet more anxious, more tuned with their feelings, yet more unstable, more focused on protecting their energy, yet more isolated. Why? Because they've learned how to feel, but not how to lead themselves. And self-love without discipline is just self-indulgence in disguise. Let that sink in, because this is where most people get stuck. They think loving themselves means never being too hard on themselves, never feeling guilt, always prioritizing comfort, avoiding anything that threatens their emotional state. But that version of self-love creates fragility. And fragility cannot build a meaningful life. Think about your own experience. How many times have you told yourself, I deserve a break, when what you really needed was focus? I'll start tomorrow, when you knew that was just avoidance. I need to protect my energy, when deep down you were just afraid to face something difficult. This is not judgment. This is awareness, because the modern world has made it incredibly easy to escape. Endless scrolling, endless distractions, endless validation loops. You can feel productive without doing anything. You can feel connected without building real relationships. You can feel good about yourself without actually improving. And slowly, without realizing it, your standards begin to drop. Not dramatically, not all at once, but subtly, quietly. Until one day you look at your life and think, how did I get here? And the answer isn't that you didn't love yourself. It's that you misunderstood what self-love actually requires. Beginning of explanation. Real self-love is not soft. It's not always gentle, it's not always comforting, and it definitely doesn't always feel good. Real self-love is honest. It is the ability to look at yourself without filters, without excuses, and tell the truth, even when that truth is uncomfortable, especially when that truth is uncomfortable. Because growth does not begin with affirmation, it begins with awareness, and awareness often feels like friction. Here is the shift you need to understand. Self-love is not how you feel about yourself, it's how you treat yourself. And how you treat yourself is revealed through your actions, not your intentions. You can say you love yourself, but if you constantly break promises to yourself, avoid the work that you know matters, stay in environments that drain you, numb yourself instead of confronting reality, then you're actually telling a different story. Because real self-love is structured, it has boundaries, it has standards, it has discipline. It asks, what kind of life do I want to build, and what version of me is required for that? And then it holds you accountable to becoming that person, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one is watching. This is where most people struggle, because they want the result of self-love without the responsibility of it. They want confidence without discipline, peace without structure, growth without discomfort. But that's not how it works. You cannot build a strong relationship with yourself if you don't trust yourself. And trust is not built through words, it's built through consistency. Imagine two versions of you. One version makes plans but doesn't follow through, sets goals but abandons them when it gets hard, speaks kindly to themselves but avoids real change. The other version keeps small promises even on difficult days, faces uncomfortable truths instead of running from them, chooses long-term growth over short-term relief. Which one do you trust more? Which one feels stronger? Which one feels stable? That second version, that is self-love in action, not glamorous, not easy, but real. And here's something most people won't tell you. Sometimes self-love looks like discipline. Sometimes it looks like saying no, not to others, but to yourself. No to distractions, no to excuses, No to behaviors that keep you stuck. Because every time you choose what is easy over what is necessary, you slowly weaken your relationship with yourself. And every time you choose what is necessary over what is easy, you strengthen it. This is why self-love cannot exist without responsibility. Because if you truly care about yourself, you don't just ask, how do I feel right now? You also ask, what does my future need from me? And that question changes everything, because now your decisions are no longer based on temporary emotions. They are guided by long-term purpose. But this is where it gets even deeper, because there is a hidden resistance that lives inside all of us, a part that avoids growth, a part that seeks comfort, a part that fears change. And if you don't learn how to deal with that part of yourself, you will keep sabotaging your own progress, not because you're weak, but because you're untrained. Self-love in its truest form is training your mind to stay when it wants to escape, training your body to act when it wants to delay, training your emotions to support you, not control you. And this kind of training requires awareness, patience, and consistency. It requires you to stop identifying with every feeling you have and start leading yourself through them. Because not every feeling deserves to be followed. Some feelings are signals, some are habits, some are distractions. And if you treat all of them as truth, you will lose direction. The question becomes, if self-love is not about always feeling good, if it's not about constant comfort, if it's not about avoiding difficulty, then what is it really? What does it actually look like day to day, moment to moment? How do you practice it when life becomes chaotic, demanding, and uncertain? And more importantly, how do you build a version of self-love that doesn't collapse under pressure, but instead makes you stronger because of it? Because the truth is, there is a form of self-love that most people never reach, a form that is quiet, grounded, and unshakable, a form that doesn't rely on motivation, doesn't depend on external validation, doesn't disappear when life gets hard. But to understand that, we need to go deeper into the patterns you've put, into the identity you've created, and into the hidden ways you may be betraying yourself without even realizing it. So now we go deeper, because once you begin to understand that self-love is not comfort, not indulgence, not escape, something uncomfortable starts to surface. You begin to notice patterns, not in the world, in yourself, patterns that have been quietly shaping your life for years. And the most unsettling part, you didn't consciously choose most of them. There is a version of you that was built out of adaptation, a version that learned how to survive, not how to grow, and that version still lives inside you. It learned early how to avoid rejection, how to seek approval, how to stay safe instead of standing out, how to delay discomfort instead of confronting it. It became efficient at protecting you. But protection is not the same as progress, and this is where the conflict begins. Because now you have two forces operating within you. One part of you wants to evolve. It wants discipline, structure, meaning it wants to become someone stronger, more focused, more intentional. But another part of you resists. It whispers, not today. You deserve a break, poet. Just one more distraction. You can do it later. And this voice is persuasive, not because it's logical, but because it's familiar. Familiarity is one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. Even when something is unhealthy, if it's familiar, it feels safe. That's why people stay in patterns they know are holding them back. Not because they enjoy them, but because they understand them. And the unknown, even if it leads to growth, feels threatening. This is why change feels so difficult. It's not just about effort, it's about identity. Because when you start trying to become someone new, you are, in a very real sense, letting go of who you've been. And the mind resists that. It clings to the old patterns, the old behaviors, the old narratives, even if they are limiting, even if they are painful, because they are predictable. So when you sit down to focus and suddenly feel the urge to check your phone, when you know what you need to do, but you still delay it, when you promise yourself change but repeat the same behaviors, it's not a lack of intelligence, it's not a lack of ambition, it's a lack of alignment between who you are and who you're trying to become. And this is where self-love becomes uncomfortable again, because real self-love doesn't just comfort the version of you that exists. It challenges it. It asks, are you willing to outgrow the habits that once protected you? Are you willing to become unfamiliar to yourself? Because growth requires a certain level of identity disruption, and most people avoid that, not consciously. But instinctively, think about this carefully. If your current identity is built on inconsistency, then consistency will feel unnatural. If your current identity is built on avoidance, then discipline will feel like pressure. If your current identity is built on seeking comfort, then discomfort will feel like danger. So when you try to change your behavior, your internal system reacts as if something is wrong, even when you're doing the right thing. This is why motivation doesn't last, because motivation operates on emotion, but identity operates on belief. And beliefs are far more powerful. You don't rise to your goals, you fall to your identity. Let that settle, because it changes how you approach everything. If you see yourself as someone who struggles with discipline, then every moment of resistance will reinforce that belief. If you see yourself as someone who can't stay consistent, then inconsistency becomes your default, not because it's true, but because it's familiar. So real self-love requires something deeper than surface level change. It requires identity reconstruction. It requires you to question, who have I been, and is that version of me still serving my future? But here's the challenge: you cannot hate yourself into becoming better, and you also cannot comfort yourself into becoming better. You need something in between, something most people never develop: self-respect. Self-respect is different from self-love as it's commonly taught. It is behavioral, it is built through action, and it is maintained through standards. Self-respect says, I do what I said I would do, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when no one is watching. And every time you follow through on something you committed to, you reinforce a new identity, not through words, but through proof. This is why small actions matter more than big intentions, because identity is not built in grand moments. It is built in quiet, repeated decisions: waking up when you said you would, finishing what you started, saying no when it would be easier to say yes. These moments don't feel dramatic, but they are transformative. And yet this is where people struggle the most, not because the actions are impossible, but because they underestimate their importance. They wait for motivation, they wait for the right mood, they wait until they feel ready. But readiness is a myth. Action creates readiness. And here is something deeper. Every time you avoid something you know you should do, you don't just delay progress, you damage trust with yourself, and that damage accumulates quietly over time until you reach a point where your own words no longer carry weight. You say you'll change, but a part of you doesn't believe it anymore. This is one of the most painful places a person can reach, not because of failure, but because of internal disconnection. Because when you lose trust in yourself, everything becomes harder. Discipline feels forced, goals feel distant, effort feels meaningless. Self-love, in its truest form, must rebuild that trust, not through affirmations, but through alignment. Alignment between what you say and what you do. And this is where the real work begins. Because rebuilding trust with yourself is not about doing everything perfectly. It's about becoming reliable. It's about proving through consistent action that you can depend on yourself, even in small ways, especially in small ways. But there's another layer to this, one that most people avoid entirely, because it requires brutal honesty. You have to confront the ways you've been betraying yourself, not occasionally, repeatedly. The habits you keep returning to, the distractions you keep justifying, the environments you refuse to leave, the standards you keep lowering. And this is not about guilt, it's about clarity, because you cannot change what you refuse to acknowledge. There is a version of your life that requires more from you, more discipline, more focus, more responsibility. And every time you choose comfort over that version, you reinforce the gap between who you are and who you could become. This gap is where frustration lives. This gap is where self-doubt grows. This gap is where people begin to feel stuck. Because deep down, you know what you're capable of, you know what you're avoiding, you know where you're holding back. And ignoring that awareness doesn't remove it, it just makes it heavier. So the question becomes, what does it look like to close that gap? Not in theory, not in motivation, but in real practical terms. How do you build a version of yourself that you actually trust? How do you create internal stability in a world full of distraction? How do you practice self-love in a way that strengthens you instead of softening you? Because there is a structure to this. A way of thinking, a way of acting, a way of relating to yourself that changes everything. But to access it, you have to be willing to let go of something first, something subtle, something deeply ingrained, something that feels like it's protecting you, but is actually keeping you stuck. And once you see it clearly, you'll realize it has been shaping far more of your life than you ever noticed. So now we arrive at something subtle but deeply controlling, something that has been quietly shaping your decisions, your habits, your identity without asking for your permission. It doesn't look like fear. It doesn't feel like weakness. In fact, most of the time it feels justified, reasonable, even intelligent. It is the need to feel ready. This is the pattern. I'll start when I feel more motivated. I'll change when I'm in a better mindset. Take action when I'm more confident. And on the surface, it sounds logical. Why wouldn't you want to feel prepared before doing something difficult? Why wouldn't you wait until you're in the right state? But this is where the trap is, because readiness is not a requirement for action. It is a result of action. And if you build your life around waiting to feel ready, you will spend most of your life waiting. This is one of the most common forms of self-betrayal. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. You delay the work that matters, not because you can't do it, but because you don't feel like doing it. And slowly, this becomes your identity. You become someone who thinks more than they act, plans more than they execute, weights more than they move, and over time, this creates something dangerous, not failure, but stagnation, because stagnation feels safe. There's no risk, no exposure, no discomfort, but there is also no growth. And here is where self-love must become confrontational again, because real self-love does not ask, do I feel ready? It asks, is this necessary? This is a completely different way of operating, because now your actions are not controlled by emotion. They are guided by intention. Think about how often your life is dictated by how you feel in the moment. You wake up tired, so you delay the day. You feel distracted, so you avoid focus. You feel uncertain, so you postpone decisions. And each of these moments seems small, insignificant, but they accumulate. Your life is not built in dramatic shifts. It is built in repeated responses to ordinary moments. And if your default response is avoidance, then avoidance becomes your lifestyle. So here is the uncomfortable truth. If you only act when you feel like it, you will never become someone you respect. Because the version of you that you admire, the version that is disciplined, focused, consistent, that version does not rely on feelings to act. It relies on standards. Standards are what you do, regardless of how you feel. And this is where identity begins to change, not when you set goals, but when you set non-negotiable. Negotiables are powerful because they remove decision fatigue. They remove emotional debate. They remove the internal negotiation that sounds like, should I do this now or later? Instead, the answer is already decided. This is what I do. And at first, this feels restrictive. It feels rigid. It feels uncomfortable because you are no longer allowing your emotions to lead. But over time, something shifts. You begin to feel a different kind of freedom, not the freedom of doing whatever you want, but the freedom of becoming someone you trust. And that is a much, much deeper form of peace. Now let's go even deeper, because there is another layer to this resistance, and it's one that most people never confront directly. It is the fear of discovering your own potential. This sounds strange at first. Why would someone fear their own growth? Why would someone resist becoming better? But if you look closely, you'll start to see it, because growth comes with responsibility. If you become more disciplined, you can no longer use laziness as an excuse. If you become more aware, you can no longer ignore your patterns. If you become more capable, you can no longer settle for less, and that is uncomfortable because it removes your ability to hide. There is a strange comfort in underperformance because it gives you an excuse. I could do more, but I'm just not trying right now. That sentence protects your ego because it separates your potential from your results. But once you start trying fully, consistently, seriously, that separation disappears. Now your results reflect your effort, and that truth can feel exposing. So what do most people do? They stay in the middle, not failing completely, but not committing fully. Just enough effort to feel like they're trying, but not enough to risk finding out what they're truly capable of. This is one of the deepest forms of self-sabotage, because it doesn't look like giving up. It looks like almost consistent, almost disciplined, almost focused, almost. It becomes a pattern. But self-love cannot exist in almost, because almost is avoidance in disguise. Real self-love requires commitment, not intensity for a few days, but consistency over time. And consistency is not built through motivation. It is built through structure. Structure is what supports you when motivation disappears. And this is where you begin to shift from emotional living to intentional living. You stop asking, what do I feel like doing today? And you start asking, what does my life require from me today? That question is powerful because it moves you out of your current mood and into your long-term direction. Now, let's address something important, because at this point, it might feel like self-love is becoming harsh, rigid, demanding. But that's not the full picture, because discipline without understanding can turn into self-punishment, and that is not self-love either. There is a balance here, a balance between pushing yourself and understanding yourself, because sometimes the resistance you feel is not laziness, it's misalignment. Sometimes you are not avoiding the work. You are avoiding the wrong path, and this is why awareness remains essential, because discipline applied in the wrong direction will still leave you feeling empty. So self-love must include reflection. It must include asking, is this path actually meaningful to me, or am I chasing something that doesn't align with who I am? Because forcing yourself into a life that doesn't fit is not growth, it's internal conflict, and that conflict will eventually break your consistency. So the deeper form of self-love is not just about doing more, it's about doing what matters. But here's the challenge. Most people don't slow down long enough to figure that out. They stay busy, distracted, reactive. And in that state, they never develop clarity. So now we arrive at another important question. If self-love requires discipline, if it requires identity change, if it requires alignment, then how do you actually build it into your daily life? Not in theory, not in motivation, but in real, repeatable systems. How do you wake up and operate from this mindset without constantly falling back in old patterns? Because knowing the truth is not the same as living it, and the gap between those two is where most people get lost. So in the next part, we're going to break that gap down into practical shifts, into daily behaviors, into a structure you can actually follow. Because self-love, when understood correctly, is not just a concept, it is a way of living. And that's exactly what we're about to build. So now we move from understanding into application, because insight by itself changes nothing. You can see your patterns clearly. You can understand your habits deeply. You can even feel motivated to change and still remain the same. Why? Because awareness without structure collapses under pressure. Life is not lived in quiet moments of reflection. It is lived in chaos, in distraction, in fatigue, in uncertainty. And if your version of self-love only exists when things are calm, then it is not strong enough. So the question becomes, how do you build a version of self-love that survives real life? Not a temporary mindset, not a burst of motivation, but something stable, something repeatable, something that holds even when you don't feel like it. The answer is simpler than people expect, but much harder to commit to. You build self-love through systems, not goals, not intentions. Systems. Because goals are momentary, they give direction, but they do not create behavior. Systems, on the other hand, shape your daily actions. They remove reliance on emotion. They create consistency without needing motivation. Let's break this down. Most people approach change like this. They feel inspired, they set a big goal, they rely on willpower, and eventually they fall back into old patterns. Not because they're incapable, because they built their change on unstable ground. Willpower is limited, motivation is temporary, motion is unpredictable. So if your behavior depends on these, your consistency will always break. But systems change the game, because systems answer a different question. Not what do I want to achieve, but how do I operate every day? This is where love becomes practical. Because now, instead of chasing outcomes, you are building identity through routine. Let's make this real. If you want to become someone disciplined, you don't focus on becoming disciplined. You focus on creating a system that makes discipline automatic, waking up at a consistent time, setting a defined start to your day, removing distractions before they appear, creating clear blocks of focus. These are not dramatic actions. They are simple, almost boring, because consistency is not built on intensity. It is built on simplicity repeated daily. And here is something most people overlook. Your environment shapes your behavior more than your intentions. You can have the strongest mindset in the world. Yeah. If your environment constantly pulls you toward distraction, you will struggle. So self-love must include designing your environment, not just mentally, physically, digitally, socially. Look at your surroundings. What is easy for you right now? Distraction or focus, comfort or growth. If your phone is always within reach, if your time is unstructured, if your space encourages passivity, then your behavior will follow that pattern. So instead of constantly fighting yourself, change what surrounds you, make distractions harder to access, make productive actions easier to begin. This is not weakness, it's intelligence, because self-love is not about testing your limits every day. It's about creating conditions where you don't have to fight as hard. Now let's go deeper into something even more important, your relationship with time. Most people treat time emotionally. They work when they feel like it. They rest when they feel like it. They delay when they feel resistance. But this creates chaos. Self-love requires structure and how rigid control, intentional design. Instead of asking, how much should I do today, when I do things that matter? This removes uncertainty. It removes decision fatigue. It removes the constant internal debate, because now your day has a shape, a rhythm, a flow. And within that structure, you begin to feel something new, clarity. Clarity reduces anxiety. Clarity increases focus. Clarity builds momentum, and momentum is powerful. Because once you start moving consistently, you don't need to rely on motivation. Movement creates its own energy. But there is another piece to this, one that determines whether your system holds or collapses, your response to failure, because no system is perfect, no routine is flawless, no person is consistently at their best. You will have days where you fall off, days where you avoid, days where you choose comfort over growth. And in those moments, your reaction matters more than the mistake itself. Most people respond in one of two ways. They either become harsh, blaming themselves, criticizing themselves, losing momentum completely, or they become passive, justifying the behavior, ignoring the pattern, continuing the cycle. Both are forms of disconnection, but self-love responds differently. It responds with accountability, not emotional punishment, not careless acceptance, but clear, grounded correction. It says, that was not aligned with who I'm becoming. And then it returns to the system quickly, without drama, without overthinking, because the longer you stay disconnected, the harder it becomes to return. So self-love is not about never failing. It's about returning faster. That is what builds trust. Now let's take this even further, because systems and discipline create structure. But there is still something deeper that determines your direction, your standards. Standards are the invisible rules you live by, what you tolerate, what you accept, what you allow in your life. And these standards shape everything: your habits, your relationships, your environment, your identity. If your standards are low, your life will reflect that. If your standards are high, your life will begin to rise to meet them. But here's the truth: most people don't consciously set their standards, they inherit them from their environment, from their past, from their fears, and then they wonder why they feel stuck. So self-love requires a conscious decision. What do I no longer accept from myself? No more broken promises, no more unnecessary distractions, no more avoiding what matters. This is where self-love becomes powerful, because now you are not reacting to life, you are defining it. But this brings us to something even more challenging, because once you raise your standards, you will feel resistance, not just internally, but externally. People may not understand your changes. They may question your discipline. They may feel uncomfortable with your growth. And this creates pressure to return to who you were, pressure to stay familiar, pressure to not outgrow your environment. So self-love must also include the ability to stand alone, not emotionally isolated, but internally grounded, because growth often requires separation from old habits, separation from limiting environments, separation from versions of yourself that no longer fit. And that process is not easy. It can feel lonely. It can feel uncertain. It can feel uncomfortable, but it is necessary, because you cannot build a new life while holding on to everything from the old one. So now we arrive at a deeper realization. Self-love is not just internal. It is expressed through how you live, through your actions, through your standards, through your environment. And when all of these align, something powerful begins to happen. You stop chasing confidence. You start building it, not through affirmation, but through evidence, because confidence is not a feeling. It is a memory of showing up, a memory of following through, a memory of becoming someone reliable. And over time, that memory becomes identity. But there is still one final layer we need to uncover, because even with systems, even with discipline, even with high standards, there is something deeper that determines whether this version of you lasts or slowly fades away, something tied to meaning, to direction. Because without that, even the strongest systems can feel empty. And when things feel empty, consistency becomes difficult again. So in the next part, we go deeper than habits, deeper than discipline, into purpose, into meaning, into the reason behind everything you're building. Because when that becomes clear, self-love transforms completely. And that's where everything starts to connect. So now if you've stayed through this entire journey, you can feel it. Something has shifted, not just in what you think self-love is, because at the beginning, self-love may have felt like something soft, something emotional, something tied to comfort, to ease, to feeling good. But now you understand self-love is not something you feel. It is something you practice. It is built in the quiet moments, the invisible decisions, the choices no one sees. It is built when you wake up and follow through. Even when you don't feel like it, it is built when you face something difficult. Instead of escaping it, it is built when you choose what is necessary over what is easy, and slowly over time, those choices begin to shape you, become someone different. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And that is where real self-love lives, not in intensity, but in consistency, because the truth is, you don't learn to love yourself by thinking differently. You learn to love yourself by acting differently. Every time you keep a promise to yourself, I can trust myself. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, you reinforce something deeper. I am in control of my direction. Every time you face discomfort instead of avoiding it, you build something powerful. I am capable of more than I thought. And over time, these messages become beliefs, these beliefs become identity, and that identity becomes your life. This is why self-love changes everything, because when you trust yourself, you don't hesitate as much. When you respect yourself, you don't settle as easily. When you are aligned with yourself, you don't feel as lost. And suddenly, life becomes clearer, not easier, but clearer. You stop chasing motivation. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop negotiating with your emotions. Instead, you act, you build, you move forward, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's uncertain, even when it's slow, because now you understand something most people never fully grasp. Comfort does not create confidence. Avoidance does not create peace. And indulgence does not create self-love. Only alignment does. Alignment between who you say you are and how you actually live. And when those two match, something powerful happens. You feel grounded, you feel stable, you feel certain, not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer at war with yourself. And that is the deepest form of peace a person can experience. But let's be clear about something. This path is not easy. There will be days where you fall back into old habits, days where you choose comfort, days where you feel disconnected. That is part of the process, because self-love is not perfection. It is returning to your standards, returning to your structure, returning to your direction again and again. And every time you return, You strengthen the relationship you have with yourself. That is how trust is built, not through never failing, but through never abandoning yourself. So from this point forward, the question is no longer, do I love myself? The question becomes, am I living in a way that reflects it? In your habits, in your discipline, in your boundaries, in your decisions, because self-love is not something you declare. It is something you demonstrate daily, quietly, consistently. And if you can commit to that, if you can build that version of yourself, if you can stay aligned even when it's difficult, then over time, you will no longer need to question your worth. You will no longer need constant validation. You will no longer feel the same internal conflict because you will have built something deeper, something stable, something real, a relationship that is based on trust, on respect, on truth. And from that place, everything else begins to change. Your focus sharpens, your standards rise, your action becomes clearer, not because the world changed, but because you did. So don't leave this as an idea. Don't let it stay as something that sounded good in the moment. Take it with you into your routine, into your decisions, into your life. Because the version of you that you've been trying to become is not built through inspiration. It is built through self-love, the real kind. And now you know exactly what that means.